Salt.
In September 2011, the president of the SALT Institute wrote to the Secretary of Agriculture and the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, requesting the withdrawal of the sodium provisions of the 2010 Dietary Guidelines for Americans because they plainly violated the National Nutrition Monitoring and Related Research Act. This act requires the USDA and HHS to publish nutritional and dietary information and guidelines for the general public based on the preponderance of scientific and medical knowledge which is current at the time the report is prepared. The letter demonstrated how the process used by USDA and HHS to develop the sodium provisions of the 2010 Dietary Guidelines was systematically flawed. Let's take a look at that process for a moment. The sodium provisions of the Dietary Guidelines are based upon the dietary reference intakes published by the Institute of Medicine in 2004. The chairman of the original panels on the dietary reference intakes for electrolytes and water guided the group that set the standard for sodium. It was then the job of the 2005 Dietary Guidelines to objectively evaluate whether those original 2004 DRIs for sodium was valid. So who was chosen to lead the Dietary Guidelines group to make up this evaluation? Believe it or not, the Dietary Guidelines process chose the very same person who led the establishment of the original DRI standard. Now, it doesn't take a scientific genius to see that something is wrong with choosing someone to evaluate his very own work. Is it any surprise to learn that the conclusions of the 2005 Dietary Guidelines was that the original DRI standard for sodium was okay? Normally, you should have expected any ethical scientist to excuse themselves from being part of the process simply because of the obvious conflict of interest. But that did not happen here. The process went along as if everything was proper. If that was not bad enough, along comes the 2010 Dietary Guidelines with the charge of objectively evaluating the 2005 Dietary Guidelines. Now, who do you think is asked to evaluate the sodium provisions? You guessed it, the very same person who led the sodium provisions of the 2005 Dietary Guidelines. That's right, the very same person. This is what is passed off as a clean analysis of the evidence, continually asking the same individual to evaluate their own work. The sad thing is that it is all part of a record of a process that no longer appears to know what the term objective evaluation really means. It gives me no pleasure to challenge the integrity of our great institutions, but when ethics are compromised to such an extent, there is little choice but to point it out. The SALT Institute letter concluded that the USDA and HHS agencies had adopted a practice of continual justification of preordained conclusions, rather than doing their statutory duty and setting standards based upon a fresh and rigorous assessment of all the available scientific and medical evidence. The 2005 and 2010 Dietary Guidelines were strikes 1 and 2 to the integrity of a government process that was supposed to be honest and objective. The Secretaries of Agriculture and Health and Human Services provided no response to the charges leveled in the letter. In the run-up to the 2015 Dietary Guidelines, salt reduction advocates planned their strategy to counter the massive evidence that was coming in following the 2010 Dietary Guidelines. Prior to the establishment of the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, a group of 16 authors, all known for their long-standing support of population-wide salt reduction, published what they and the American Heart Association pompously billed as a presidential advisory on sodium, blood pressure, and cardiovascular disease. In this publication, they disparaged every single study published that did not support their salt reduction dogma. They did this without presenting any new evidence, but relied on their collective opinions, which they passed off as if they were facts. As it happened, one of the lead authors of that presidential advisory ended up being selected to serve on the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Group. She not only served on the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Group, but was made head of the sodium working group of that dietary guideline. That's right, an individual who publicly concluded long before the dietary guidelines evaluation process began that the new studies were all useless. That person was selected to lead the so-called objective study on the evaluation of the very same studies. Once again, the process was opened up to preconceived notions. There is no credible possibility that this same individual could reassess the very same data for the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Group and come up with conclusions different to the ones that she published in the Presidential Advisory. If normal scientific ethics were to prevail, this individual should have recused herself from the Dietary Guidelines process because of a lack of objectivity. Yet, that did not happen. As far as the sodium provisions of the Dietary Guidelines are concerned, that was strike three. So the question remains, can the Dietary Guidelines be redeemed? Based on their published record, I don't think so. The process has proven itself to be an incorrigible repeat offender. I think it's time to follow the three strikes rule. The Dietary Guidelines have never done the public any good. It's time to scrap them.
Salt.